the experience of hi-fi can be so incredible. I think that we struggle to explain the phenomenon. Hey everybody, this is Nick from Nick's Listening Space. Today's discussion is going to be about the most commonly used hi-fi terms. I find this topic kind of fascinating because if we stretch our imagination a little bit back to the beginning of stereo development, you can imagine that people back then, as they developed this technology and sat down to listen to it, those guys had experiences with it. And you can imagine that even back then, people were trying to describe what they were hearing. Paul McGowan of PS Audio, he has a whole book series out called the Audiophile Guide. And I don't have all of them, but I have his book on the listening room. And it's been a really interesting read, as far as like some of the editing is concerned and some of that. There's some like kind of poor editing happening in this book. But aside from that, there's just a wealth of information and knowledge from somebody that has had a lifetime of experience. And so, in his book, he writes that in a modest research lab at Bell Labs in 1933, Harvey Fletcher paced back and forth, deep in thought. He wasn't concerned with the electronics scattered across his workbench. His mind was focused on the space around him. The room itself, he had come to realize, was as crucial to the reproduction of music as any amplifier or speaker. Fletcher had made an accidental discovery while testing early stereo systems. Moving his test speakers into different locations dramatically changed the sound, not just its volume or direction, but its very character. The room, Fletcher explained, is like an invisible conductor, shaping every note, every harmony. Get it wrong, and it's like performing in a shower stall. Get it right, and the walls seem to melt away, leaving only the music. He goes on to say that fast forward to today, we find ourselves still reaching for the right words to describe what we hear. The vocabulary of sound has evolved into a rich tapestry of terms that help us communicate the subtle nuances of audio reproduction. Paul goes on to list like 15 of his terms or his top used terms. And as I read through those terms, I really resonated with those because I think those are the terms that I use and many other people use. The first term is imaging. And what does imaging mean? Imaging is a system's ability to create a three-dimensional reproduction of the music. Or essentially, like when you go see a live concert, you're going to get a sense of placement of each instrument or each member of the band. Now, the next one is going to be Soundstage. And Soundstage is really just a subset of imaging. And what Soundstage represents, again, is kind of this like invisible stage that a band plays on. There's boundaries to that you can feel, that you can hear. The next one is going to be the depth of image. When we say depth, what we're really referring to is from the most forward sound to the farthest sound in the back. When you get incredible depth in a sound stage, you get the sense of space. The vocalist will be farther out from the drummer, or maybe there's a lead guitar solo that pops out through the track, and then that solo now rips forward above everything else. That's what we mean by depth of image. Now, the next one is very similar, and that's image width. Image width is just a descriptor that we use to identify or describe how far the sound bleeds out past the placement of speakers. And so we really want sound that is much bigger than where our speakers are placed. That sound stage, you want it to feel much wider, okay, than this narrow kind of point source. When we get a wider sound stage, there again, we're getting a more immersion of audio enveloping space. Rather, we're not going for a point source. We don't want audio just to shoot out and hit us directly in our ears. We want it to envelop us. And so that's what we mean by image width. Now, the next one is going to be frequency response. And, ideally, you have a system that goes from all the way down here at the lowest possible frequency range to the highest possible frequency range. Now, even though our human hearing has limitations to what we can actually hear, there are some of those frequency ranges that are not heard, but they're felt. And particularly with low end or sub bass, you're going to get more of a visceral bass, or rather a bass that's felt and not necessarily heard. And so that's why we care about frequency range when we're talking about individual components. Ideally, we can play all frequency ranges. Now, the next one is dynamic range. Dynamic range, what that's describing is a speaker or a component's ability to very quickly move from low end to high end, or there's a range that you can make out or hear. And so a great dynamic speaker is going to be able to play these incredibly low passages and then, a split second later be able to completely switch and play higher end frequencies. And so to be able to sense that and experience that is what we mean by high degree of dynamic range, or a component with a lot of dynamics. Oftentimes you might review a component and I might say that's very mid-range centric. And what do I mean by that? I mean that component doesn't have that great sense of dynamic ranges. Now, the next term I want to use is distortion. Oh, distortion. Oh, no. So like our first reaction is to think distortion is terrible. Why would you want to add distortion? But what distortion is can be describing at times is like a change in sound that wasn't originally there in the recording. And sometimes distortion is a welcomed characteristic or trait that we want to add into the sound. And, things like tube amplifiers will add overtones or second round harmonics and things like that. And in that sense, we think of distortion as being something welcomed or desired. Now, the next two terms are somewhat complex, I think, unless you are a musician or an engineer, but you oftentimes will hear people use the term timbre or harmonics. And so what do I mean by that, right? Well, high-end audio, not just the fundamental tones, but also the delicate interplay of harmonics that give music its richness and complexity. So this is critical to creating a lifelike, engaging listening experience that truly brings music to life. When an instrument is played, it produces not just the fundamental frequency, like note C, but also a series of higher frequencies called overtones or harmonics. So when you pluck the string of a guitar, there is the initial moving the finger onto it. There is sound being produced in the action of playing that note that is what you would describe as overtones, perhaps, right? So you're going to get note C, but you're also going to get the decay of like the movement before and after. Now, the next term that often used is transparency. And if you had the perfect transparent system, that system would have no additional coloration. Typically, like in a studio environment, for example, you would want to have a high degree of transparency because you would really want to be able to pick out every little nuance in the recording so that when you're in the studio mixing that track, you can find little mess ups or background things that weren't supposed to be in the mix, etc. When we think about that term in relation to creating an emotional experience, sometimes transparency is something we don't actually want to have. having something too transparent can be too revealing and therefore reveal poor recordings. And sometimes that's not something we're searching for playing, poorly recorded pop music or hip hop or punk music or things of that nature. The next one is going to be resolution. And when we think about resolution in audio, we kind of compare that to, say, resolution in an image. And there's a difference between a 1080p image and a 4K image. And so when we're talking about, streaming music or playing CDs and converting that process through a DAC, for example, right? We want to have a DAC that can reproduce that music at the highest resolution possible. When we have a greater degree of resolution, we get more subtle nuances in the mix. That's when you begin to hear things like breaths. That's when you begin to hear things like fingers moving along the guitar strings, things like that. Essentially, we're just able to peer deeper into the mix and get more edges defined. The next one is neutrality. When we say neutrality, what we're meaning is you're hearing the electronics without any kind of added coloration. You'll often hear people say you need to have a neutral speaker, or that the goal is to have a neutral speaker or a neutral amp, right? And oftentimes when people are building a reference-based system, you want to have a neutral component. Amplifier, what you're going to hear is the true sound of that speaker without any added coloration of the amplifier. Circling back to distortion, when we say add distortion or add color or flavor into the mix, that can really be thought of from any particular component in your chain, right? You can have a neutral amplifier and then pair that with a highly colored speaker, or you can have an incredibly neutral speaker and pair that with an incredibly colored amplifier. That's one way that we think about neutrality as it relates to, hi-fi components. Warmth. Warmth is like probably one of the most heavily used terms that you'll hear people use, right? And it's kind of hard to really even put a finger on what warmth means. But warmth for me in particular, I think means that what I'm hearing from the setup is a sound that is going to lean a little bit more mid-range centric, perhaps a less colder, and one that has more emphasis on mid-range and perhaps low end. The other way to think about warmth is probably for me, it has to do a little bit with how fluid does it sound and how smooth it sounds. Just to kind of extend that conversation a little bit farther, you'll oftentimes hear people say vinyl is a warm experience compared to digital. Digital's cold. Or another thing you'll always hear people say is like when they're talking about DACs, right? An R2R DAC is warm. A, ESS Sabre DAC tends to lean a little bit cold, right? When we say cold, we just mean it's an emphasis on either like neutrality or treble and top-end extension versus something that is more emphasizing the mid-range and the low end. And kind of on the other side of that spectrum, there is brightness, which I think, again, can kind of be interchanged with cold or sometimes neutral. Like for me, that's all kind of one wheelhouse, perhaps. A system with a high degree of brightness might have, really like cymbals that really stand out in shimmer and sparkle. And sometimes with a system like that, I find can be incredibly holographic because those really high-end frequencies at times tend to be very quick and very fast. And those frequency ranges will bounce and move around space much quicker than low-end frequencies. So, bass notes, and for example, those are a longer wave or a much larger wave that moves slower through space versus higher end frequencies that are much faster and quicker. And so when you have a system that tends to be very bright, that's what you're going to get, is an emphasis on those higher end frequencies and also some of that speediness that you get in that high end frequency range. A system that can end up too bright can be described as sibilance. And so sibilance is the next term. Sibilance is describing an overemphasis on kind of that hissing or that S sound, that overemphasis on that. And that can lead to being an overly harsh mix. It can lead to ear fatigue, things like that. The next term is crossover. And a crossover in a speaker, another kind of form of a crossover might be a low pass filter or a high pass filter, so that you can filter out low frequencies or high frequencies and then send those off to a subwoofer or your main speakers. That would be another kind of form of a crossover. But the goal of a crossover is to act like a traffic cop and, direct frequency ranges to the individual drivers. A great speaker design is also going to come with a great crossover design. Because when all that signal is being fed into the speaker that has 3 or 4 drivers, the ideal scenario is that each one of those drivers is kind of min-maxing its efficiency. We don't want a speaker to play frequency ranges that are not necessary when we have another driver in the cabinet that could do a better job. Kind of, I think also within that crossover, there is this metric of speed, and you want to have a speaker that can very quickly cross those things over. Because when you're playing music through there, right, every millisecond, those crossovers are working to redirect sound. Now, the last one is impedance. And I think impedance is a really tricky one to understand, because we use impedance when it comes to rating speakers, and there's a lot of debate about that. But basically, impedance is a measure of electrical opposition in an AC circuit. In hi-fi, it's relevant because we want to carefully select the impedance of each component. And so in your system, your preamplifier, for example, will have an input impedance and an output impedance. Your DAC will have an output and an input impedance, and vice versa. Now, the relationship between all of these impedances is critical for producing optimal signal. For example, the preamplifier's output impedance should be lower than your amplifier's input impedance. So if what's coming out of your preamplifier is 2 ohms, you want your input on your amplifier to be more than 2 ohms, so 3 or 4 ohms. Now, the amplifier's output impedance is going to affect the ability to move the speaker, right? Now, essentially what that is describing is damping factor. Oftentimes, you'll hear people describe this speaker requires an amplifier with a high damping factor. And then lastly with that, it's important to note that impedance is not ever fixed. It's something that is an average measurement based on the different frequency range being fed through the chain. So yeah, guys, those are 15 of the most commonly used hi-fi terms. And if you guys like this video, please leave a thumbs up and hit that bell notification. And I'm really curious what you think about these terms. And if there's any other terms that I missed, or there's any other terms that you're confused by, leave those comments down below. Anyways, have a good day, guys.